The subject of the following 7-part program is JFK, the assassination, the cover-up, and beyond, which will be presented by James H. Fetzer, a professor of philosophy at the University of Minnesota who teaches on its Duluth campus. Dr. Fetzer received his A.B. in philosophy from Princeton University, magna cum laude, and his Ph.D. in the history and philosophy of science from Indiana University. A former commissioned officer in the Marine Corps, Dr. Fetzer organized a research group to collaborate on the investigation of the assassination of JFK during November of 1992. This is a report of the results of their individual and collective efforts.
When it comes to the assassination of JFK, don't believe anything you read or see or hear, even from me, without independent corroborating evidence. That includes what you find in the newspapers. Gary Trudeau, for example, recently devoted Doonesbury to an examination of the assassination, which he concluded, as these panels show, with a comparison of the official Warren Commission report, in which Lee Harvey Oswald, a lone, demented gunman, fires 3 shots with a high-velocity rifle from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building, scoring 2 hits, killing the president and wounding the governor of Texas, with what he refers to as a composite conspiracy scenario involving at least 4 presumably non-demented shooters who fire 8 shots and achieve the same result, but where the number of conspirators is in the hundreds. Now, the point Doonesbury is making, no doubt, is that the official Warren report provides a far simpler explanation of events in Dallas that fateful day than does a conspiracy scenario. However, simpler accounts are to be preferred only if they are also adequate. For example, the Warren Commission was never able to successfully identify either motive or means or opportunity in the case of Oswald. Within 90 seconds of the assassination, for example, he was observed on the 2nd floor of the School Book Depository building drinking a Coke by a motorcycle patrolman and by his supervisor in the School Book Depository building. But if he was on the 2nd floor drinking a Coke, he could not also have been on the 6th floor firing at the president. Plus, in order to account for all the wounds that were sustained by the president and the governor on the basis of only 2 bullets, the commission was forced to conclude that one of these bullets had entered the president's back, exited his throat, entered the governor's back, shattered a rib, exited his chest, had shattered his wrist, and wound up impacting in his thigh. A bullet which, nevertheless, turned out to be virtually free from deformity and has come to be known, therefore, as the magic bullet. 75 to 85% of the American public have remained skeptical of the Warren report and don't accept it. In fact, although Gary Trudeau does not make this point, neither does the American government. The assassination was reinvestigated by the House Select Committee on Assassinations from 1977 to 1979 and concluded that, in fact, there had been at least 2 shooters firing at least 4 bullets in Dealey Plaza on that fateful day. This scenario, in fact, is not very different from the conspiracy scenario that was advanced by Josiah Thompson in his book 6 Seconds in Dallas and covered in the Saturday Evening Post on the 2nd of November, 1967. According to Josiah Thompson's scenario, there were 3 shooters firing at the president who fired 4 shots, each of which hit. So the principal difference between the House Select Committee on Assassinations report, which had 2 assassins firing 4 shots with 2 misses, and Josiah Thompson's scenario, 3 assassins firing 4 shots, all of which hit, is that on the Josiah Thompson scenario, the assassins are better shooters who make better shots. There are several other assassination scenarios beyond Josiah Thompson's, which include, as you see here, 5-shot, 6-shot, 7-shot, 8, 9, and 10-shot scenarios. It may seem difficult to imagine that an assassination could have involved numerous conspirators firing numerous shots and that you not have learned about it from your government. But in fact, the government has been very successful at keeping secrets when it had a mind to do so. The bombing of Cambodia, for example, lasted for many months. The pilots who flew the planes knew what was going on, and certainly so did the Cambodians. Individuals at the Pentagon who were planning these raids were knowledgeable, as were officials at the CIA and at the White House. Practically the only people who did not know about the bombing of Cambodia were the American people. The Iran-Contra affair is another illustration where many individuals knew what was going on in trading arms with the Iranians in order to obtain money that was being provided to the Contras. The Iranian government knew, the Contra leaders knew, no doubt the CIA knew, the Pentagon knew. Once again, practically the only ones who did not know were the American people. Now, you may be thinking that events in the Near East or in the Far East might be easy to conceal. But as a matter of fact, our government has been very successful in keeping from the American people information about events going on here in the United States. For example, we have recently discovered that for over 40 years, hundreds of American citizens have been subjected to experiments involving radioactivity, which involve cooperation between some of the best physicians and some of the best hospitals in the United States. Without any question, hundreds of people have known about this for over 4 decades, and yet you and I, the American people, have not known. So we should not, I think, suppose that merely because the assassination might have been complex, that therefore the American government would have told us. The American government can know these things and nevertheless not share them with the American people. The key to understanding the events that took place in Dealey Plaza, however, may lie in a different direction, namely with the medical evidence in this case, the history of which I'm going to trace for you. Consider the following 3-part diagram. The first version shows a blowout to the back of the president's head as the wound was observed at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. The body was transported, however, to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Washington, D.C., where an autopsy was performed that night. And the description that we find in the autopsy report is very different, of a much larger wound that now covers most of the area of the president's head. Subsequently, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations issued its report, however, the wound had mysteriously contracted and now represented only a small bullet hole in the vicinity of the crown, sometimes called the cowlick of the head. In order to have a convenient way to refer to the difference in these wounds, let me refer to the wound as it was observed at Parkland as the heel of a wound, which then expands to become a footprint at Bethesda, followed by, of course, this very small wound then, this entrance wound at the crown of the head, sometimes referred to as the cowlick in the official report of the House Select Committee. Now, the fact that the House Select Committee on Assassination concluded that there had been at least 2 gunmen and that a conspiracy had taken place in the assassination of JFK has not inhibited others from arriving at a different opinion. A series of articles that appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association, for example, starting in May of 1992, provided interviews with 2 of the physicians who had participated in the autopsy at Bethesda and reiterated the thesis that the president had been killed by 2 shots fired from above and behind by a lone assassin. When I first discovered that this journal was publishing these articles, I found it most disturbing because the articles did not take into account all of the available relevant evidence in the case of the assassination, and therefore violated a fundamental requirement of scientific reasoning, which is known as the principle of total evidence. On the contrary, what happened in these articles was the adoption of a very different methodology, which might be described as the principle of selection and elimination, selecting that evidence that agrees with a predetermined conclusion and eliminating the rest. I therefore sought out the dean of our medical school and conveyed to him my concerns. He responded by suggesting that I contact a member of the Board of Trustees of the AMA who is on the medical faculty on their Twin Cities campus, which I did. His name was William Jaycott, and he arranged for the editor-in-chief of JAMA, George Lundberg, to contact me. When Lundberg called me, I explained to him my concern about the articles appearing in JAMA. He responded by telling me that he was only interested in the 2 shots that he alleged had hit the president. To my surprise, he expressed no interest in how many shots might have been fired that day in Dealey Plaza, nor in how the damage might have been inflicted on the governor of Texas, nor whether any other bullets had been found in Dealey Plaza. This confirmed my suspicion that the journal was being abused, primarily, it appeared, by the editor-in-chief. And as a result, I wrote a series of letters to the trustees of the AMA explaining my concerns. In the meanwhile, the journal continued to publish, and in October, published additional articles, including a handful of letters written by members of the AMA. One of these letters caught my eye. I wrote to its author, a fellow named David Mantic, and invited him to collaborate with me. It turns out that Dr. Mantic has both a PhD in physics from the University of Wisconsin and an MD from the University of Michigan with a specialty in radiology. He practices in California at a clinic in Rancho Mirage and may be the most highly qualified individual to ever study the autopsy x-rays and the photographs in the National Archives. I subsequently received a phone call from Gary Aguilar, who's a longtime student and researcher of the assassination in San Francisco, who's lectured widely. He was at the time at the Assassination Symposium in Dallas, and he called me to ask if he could become a part of our research group. He suggested that we invite to join us a woman by the name of Kathleen Cunningham, who's a registered nurse in Ocala, Florida. Kathleen has had a great deal of success obtaining documents and records under the Freedom of Information Act from the federal government, and has proven to be an invaluable resource in our research. During the course of our investigations, I discovered a person who may be the most important living witness involved with the assassination, a very well-known physician by the name of Robert B. Livingston, who was at the time of the assassination both the scientific director of the National Institute for Mental Health and of the National Institute for Neurological Diseases and Blindness. He was the highest-ranking scientist in both the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations. He's taught at some most distinguished institutions in the country, including Stanford, Yale, Harvard, and UCLA, and founded the first department of neurosciences in the world at the University of California, San Diego, where he's professor emeritus. Another person I'd like to mention is Gerald Custer. Mr. Custer was one of the naval technicians who participated in the autopsy at Bethesda, and in fact, he took the x-rays and developed them during the actual course of the autopsy. In order to provide a background, however, for the issues that I want to pursue involving the medical evidence, I want to take us back to Dealey Plaza and the events that occurred on 22 November 1963. Prior to the transportation of the president at Parkland Hospital, where he was first observed by physicians. Most Americans are unaware that 8 or 9 motion pictures were taken of events in Dealey Plaza. Here is a diagram that reflects the different aspects of the motorcade that were covered by these different films, apart from the area shown in the dark behind the Stemmons Freeway sign, which was not covered by any motion pictures at the time this was put together in 1974. Since then, however, another film has surfaced that was taken by a fellow by the name of Charles Bronson, which actually was taken from way to the left in relation to the diagram, almost around Main Street, and actually covers that dark area behind the Stemmons Freeway sign as well. So what I want to do now is to take us back to some of this film footage of events in Dallas, Texas on that fateful day.
The weather couldn't be better. We have a brilliant sun at this moment. The wind has diminished.
When Air Force One landed at Love Field on the 22nd of November 1963, the president was completing a 3-leg trip that took him to San Antonio, Fort Worth, and Dallas, Texas. As he and the First Lady departed from the plane, they were greeted by the mayor and Mrs. Earl Cabell of Dallas. Mrs. Cabell presented Jackie with a large bouquet of long-stemmed red roses.
A dark suit steps off directly behind. Mrs. Kennedy has been presented her bouquet of brilliant red roses, and they make a lovely contrast to the bright pink suit she is wearing. The weather couldn't be better. We have a brilliant sun at this moment, and here comes the president now. In fact, he's not in his limousine. He's departed the limousine, and he is walking. He is reaching across the fence, shaking hands with many of the people who have come here to see him. He is closely accompanied by Dallas police officers and, of course, the Secret Service. He is now shaking hands, and they are walking along the line of the fence, shaking hands with some of the hundreds of people who have come here to view their arrival. And now the President and First Lady are retreating from the fence. They're heading now for the official limousine where Governor Connolly stands, waiting their arrival so that they can make their way downtown.
The presidential limousine was driven by Secret Service agent William Greer, who was accompanied by Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman. Mrs. Kennedy and the President sat in the back. Directly in front of them were the Governor and Mrs. Connolly.
President, that suddenly he has left them and stepped into the crowd, the milling throng, and decided to shake hands and give his personal greetings. And this, once again, he did. There's the gunmetal gray limousine, blue and gray, pulling away now from the fenced area. The President and Mrs. Kennedy seated on the back seat, Governor and Mrs. Connolly on the second seats or jump seats, and then the official driver and Secret Service men are in the front seat.
The Vice President was also riding in a Lincoln convertible, but it was light blue rather than the midnight blue that the President preferred.
Bird Lane to Lemon Avenue, then travel south on Lemon to Turtle Creek, Cedar Springs, through the downtown area on Harwood to Maine, west on Maine to Houston, through the Triple Underpass to Stemmons Freeway, then on to...
An ugly yellow vehicle preceded the presidential limousine and was driven by Dallas Chief of Police Jesse Curry. Seated behind him was Dallas County Sheriff Bill Decker. To Decker's right was Forrest Sorrells, the agent in charge of the Dallas branch of the Secret Service. And in front of him, on the front seat on the passenger side, was Winston Lawson, the Secret Service agent who planned this motorcade. Crowds were large and enthusiastic, as much as 12 to 15 deep, and often spilled over into the street.
Presidential limousine is turning right from Harwood Street onto Main Street and will head west for about 3/4 of a mile toward Dealey Plaza.
As the motorcade proceeded up Main Street toward Dealey Plaza, it would make a right-hand turn onto Houston Street, and then a very sharp 120-degree turn onto Elm. The motorcycle patrolman named W.B. McLean, shown here, had the habit of leaving his microphone locked on, which led to the recording of what may be an acoustical record of the assassination, which later became important evidence for the investigation by the House Select Committee on Assassinations from 1977 to 1979.
The motorcade is now turning onto Houston Street, heading for the corner of Elm Street.
At this point, the presidential limousine on Houston is heading directly toward Elm and the Texas School Book Depository building.
The President's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark. I was on Simmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the president as he made his way toward the Trade Mart.
The series of shots rang out. How many? Witnesses differed. Many said 3, some said 4, some said more. Secret Service agent Clint Hill rushed forward to lend assistance. Driver William Greer accelerated the vehicle to seek emergency medical care for the president. Many in the crowd surged up on the grassy knoll, where they were met by individuals who displayed Secret Service credentials. Later, the Secret Service would deny, however, that they had any agents stationed in Dealey Plaza, apart from those who were participating in the motorcade.
Route, something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by. The president's car is now going past me. The limousine is now...
In 1963, Dallas, Texas had one of the highest homicide rates in the country. And the physicians at Parkland Hospital, where the president would be taken, were well experienced in treating gunshot wounds.
Hospital, there has been a shooting. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound. I repeat, a shooting in the motorcade in the downtown area. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound. The presidential car coming up now. We know it's the presidential car. You can see Mrs. Kennedy's pink suit. There's a Secret Service man, spread eagle over the top of the car. We understand Governor and Mrs. Connolly are in the car with President and Mrs. Kennedy. We can't see who has been hit, if anybody's been hit, but apparently something is wrong here. Something is terribly wrong. I'm in behind the motorcade, trying to follow them. It looks as though they're going to Parkland Hospital. We're on the road to Parkland at this time. The Secret Service man is still spread eagle over whoever is in the car, the President and Mrs. Kennedy, and as we understand, Governor and Mrs. Connolly. At this point, it looks as though it could have been 1 or 2 or even all of the people within the car may have been the victims, may have been struck by shots. We don't know. Parkland Hospital in the distance, down on Harry Hines Boulevard, following behind the motorcade. They're approaching the entrance now to Parkland Hospital, traveling at a high rate of speed. I'm pulling in now toward Parkland Hospital, coming to the approach. An officer waving me down. He's waving me around. There's a cordon. There's already a cordon of police officers running from their cars, from their vehicles here. The official party, as I can see it, pulling around toward the emergency room.
The President of the United States is dead. I have just talked to Father Oscar Hubert of the Holy Trinity Catholic Church. He and another priest tell me that the pair of men have just administered the last rites of the Catholic Church to President Kennedy. I asked the father, is Mr. Kennedy dead? And his quote, he's dead all right. And just a few seconds ago, I talked to Thurman Ward, the Justice of the Peace of Garland. He's now here at the hospital to apparently officially declare that the Chief Executive of the United States has expired. President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead. Women here in shock, some fainted. Grown men, Secret Service men standing by the emergency room, tears streaming down their face. There's only one word to describe the picture here, and that's grief, and much of it. It's official. As of just a few moments ago, the President of the United States is dead.
When the president arrived at Parkland, he was taken inside to trauma room number 1 by a route that is described on this diagram. When Lee Harvey Oswald would be brought in 2 days later, he would be taken into trauma room number 2. This diagram describes the locations of several persons who were present during the president's treatment, including from the left, Dr. George Berkeley, United States Navy, who was the president's personal physician, Jacqueline Kennedy, Dr. Charles Crenshaw, Dr. Kemp Clark, the director of neurosurgery, Nurse Aubrey Bell, about whom more later, Dr. Malcolm Perry, who performed a tracheotomy on the president, and Dr. Robert McClellan. During the course of our inquiries, I also came in contact with Dr. Charles Crenshaw and asked him if he had ever made diagrams of his observations in trauma room number 1 that day. Much to my surprise, he reported that he had not. So in October of 1993, at my request, he made diagrams of his observations as follow. Here is his diagram of the throat wound. Notice it's a very small wound and has the characteristics of a wound of entrance. He also diagrammed the wound after the tracheotomy performed by Dr. Perry. Observed it's a very small wound with a very straight, clean incision, indicative of the high quality work that Dr. Perry performed. Here's a side view of the president's head showing a major defect to the back of his skull. This defect is located at the place where you'd rest your head in a bathtub if you were reclining in a tub. And here, in this 4th diagram, you can see a description of its approximate size. Dr. Crenshaw characterized this wound as approximately the size of a baseball, by which he means a hard ball, or, in other words, approximately the same circumference as that of your fist when you double it up. The president was pronounced dead at 1 o'clock and was wrapped in sheets and placed into a substantial ceremonial casket. There followed considerable controversy over whether or not the president's body ought to be removed from Parkland Hospital, however, because the only offense that had occurred was the murder of an individual. At the time, there were no federal statutes against the assassination even of a president, much less other federal officials. Although the local officials wanted the president's body to be kept at Parkland, the body was forcibly removed by the Secret Service, who even brandished their weapons in getting it out of Parkland Hospital. Admiral Berkeley, the president's personal physician, asked Kemp Clark for some reports from the various physicians about the treatment that they provided to the president. And several of the physicians provided handwritten copies of the treatment that they'd provided to the president, which were given to Admiral Berkeley together with an uncompleted death certificate, which Kemp Clark signed at the time. Now, Berkeley also asked him to provide a written summary, which he did, and which you see here in this FBI summary report. Now, it's important for several reasons. One is that it is an FBI report, and second of all, that it's dated the 25th of November, 1963, which indicates that the FBI had this information already as early as that date. Now, if you take a look at the paragraphs contained in this report, first of all, it indicates that a death certificate and statements of treatment were given to Admiral Berkeley of the White House at the time they left Parkland Hospital. Then in describing, a summary here is provided describing the wounds, where Kemp Clark says that the first physician to see the president, for example, was Dr. James Carrico. Then he described 2 exterior wounds, one in the lower third of the anterior neck, the other in the occipital region of the skull, were noted. Through the head wound, blood and brain were extruding. Now, anterior is a medical term for the front of your neck. So if you reach up to the front of your neck, of course, you'll notice that you're feeling your throat. So another way to describe this wound is to say there was a wound to the throat and another wound to the back of the skull. Dr. Marion Jenkins, director of anesthesiology, was also present. On the second page, it describes Dr. Robert McClellan as attending surgeon who arrived to help in the president's care. Further down the page appear 2 crucial sentences. There was considerable loss of scalp and bone tissue. Both cerebral and cerebellar tissue were extruding from the wound. Similar testimony would be forthcoming from Perry, McClellan, Carrico, Jenkins, Crenshaw, and others present on that occasion. Gary Aguilar has now discovered more than 40 witnesses who offer similar descriptions of the president's throat and head wounds. Finally, we find that President Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1300 hours, which of course is a 24-hour clock. That would be 1 o'clock by Dr. Kemp Clark. Now, if you take a look at this diagram of a human skull, you can see that there is a very large mass of tissue that constitutes the cerebral cortex. That is most of the mass of the brain at the top. You'll notice at the bottom, however, there's a very small area, compact part of the brain, known as the cerebellum. Plus, if you look at these regions of the skull, the back of the skull is described as the occipital bone, and there's a little bony protrusion in the back of the skull, which is known as the occipital protuberance. Subsequently, you'll find that the Bethesda pathologists maintain that there had been an entry wound in the vicinity of the occipital protuberance. Now, to anyone experienced with the human brain, the appearance of cerebral and cerebellar tissue, if it were exposed or blown out, as from gunshots, would be strikingly different. The cerebellar tissue would have the appearance of gray, maggoty tissue, whereas the cerebellum would appear much more granule and have a reddish, more hamburger-like cast. So it would be very difficult to confuse the two. Here's a pictorial representation of the wound to the back of the president's head drawn by Dr. Robert McClellan, which I believe is a highly accurate representation of the way the wound appeared at Parkland. At approximately 1:35, Malcolm Kilduff, the acting press secretary, held a short press conference to announce that the president was dead.
John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today here in Dallas. He died of a gunshot wound in the brain. Dr. Berkeley told me it's a simple matter, Tom, of a bullet right through the head.
What's most important about Malcolm Kilduff's description of the wound, no doubt, is that an entrance wound to the right temple could very easily have brought about a blowout to the back of the president's head, such as was observed by the physicians. Approximately 2 hours later, at 3:16, a press conference was held at which two of the physicians who treated the president, Dr. Kemp Clark and Dr. Malcolm Perry, were brought forward to answer questions addressed by members of the press. Dr. Perry described the president's wound several times. In this passage, for example, I noted that he was in critical condition from a wound of the neck and of the head. Immediate resuscitative measures, they asked him to go slower. The question was asked whether a tracheotomy was performed, and he affirmed that it was. Dr. Clark reports that a missile had gone in or out of the back of his head, causing extensive lacerations and loss of brain tissue. Notice the equivocation here. Dr. Clark is reporting that the missile had gone in or out of the back of the head. No doubt the appearance given by the diagrams of Dr. Crenshaw and Dr. McClellan, among others, is that that wound to the back of the head was a massive blowout or exit wound. On the next page, Dr. Perry is asked about the wound to the neck, which he describes as follows. The neck wound is visible on the patient, revealed a bullet hole almost in the midline. He repeats, a bullet hole almost in the midline in the lower portion of the neck in front. Clearly, once again, he's describing a wound to the throat. Dr. Perry is asked whether this wound could have gone through the president's head, and he responds, that would be conjecture on my part. There are two wounds, as Dr. Clark noted, one of the neck and one of the head. Whether they are directly related or related to two bullets, I cannot say. On the next page, very important testimony. Where was the entrance wound? Dr. Perry. There was an entrance wound in the neck. As regards the one in the head, I cannot say. Question, which way was the bullet coming on the neck wound? At him? Dr. Perry, it appeared to be coming at him. Observe here, Dr. Perry has now twice described the wound to the throat as a wound of entrance. There's a question about a possible rumor that LBJ had a heart attack, which turned out to be unfounded. On the next page, Dr. Perry is being pressed as to whether there were one or two bullets, and Dr. Perry is unsure as to the answer to that question, but says there could have been two just as well if the second bullet struck the head in addition to striking the neck, and I cannot tell you due to the nature of the wound. There's no way for me to tell. Another question, doctor, describe the entrance wound. You think from the front in the throat? Dr. Perry, for the third time. The wound appeared to be an entrance wound in the front of the throat. Yes, that is correct. The exit wound, I don't know. It could have been the head, or there could have been a second wound of the head. There was not time to determine this at that particular instant. The press conference didn't last very long, may have taken 20 or 30 minutes, and the description of the wounds, of a wound to the head and a wound to the throat, was very widely distributed on television and on radio. Since the president's body had been taken from Dallas and transported to Washington, D.C., where the autopsy would be performed at Bethesda Naval Hospital, There was not a great deal left to do regarding medical evidence in this case, apart from the execution of an official death certificate. Here you see the death certificate on John Fitzgerald Kennedy that was signed by Theron Ward, a Justice of the Peace, on the 6th of December 1963. Two parts of this death certificate are most important. The first is that the cause of death is described as multiple gunshot wounds of the head and neck. Multiple gunshot wounds of the head and neck. And second of all, that the injury occurred by being shot by a high-powered rifle. Shot by a high-powered rifle. Now, what's even more interesting than that death certificate is the fact that there was an earlier version which Theron Ward declined to sign. Here is a copy of that earlier version. Observe that the description of the cause of death remains the same. Multiple gunshot wounds at the head and neck. But that the description of the cause of the injury is now somewhat different. Instead of saying shot by a high-powered rifle, it now states shot by unknown assassin, singular, with high-powered rifle. That's a difference. Perhaps more important, however, than that difference is a description of findings of the justice found at the bottom of the page, which describes two gunshot wounds. The first, near the center of the body and just above the right shoulder. That comes as some surprise now. Let me read that again. Near the center of the body and just above the right shoulder. Now that clearly appears to be a wound to the back, just above the right shoulder, which I shall identify henceforth by the symbol you find in the margin, a circle with an X in it. Anytime we find a description of a wound to the back or the back of the neck, it will be identified with that circle with an X through it. But notice that that's a very different description than the earlier description of a wound to the throat. And second of all, now observe, 1 inch to the right center of the back of the head. 1 inch to the right center of the back of the head. Now, ordinarily, we'd think that a description of such a wound would identify a wound of entry. But of course, what we know from the earlier description provided by the Parkland physicians in the diagrams by Dr. McClellan and Dr. Crenshaw is that that location is the location where they observed a massive exit wound to the back of the president's head. We therefore already have encountered some of the most basic questions that need to be resolved in the assassination of the President of the United States. For example, was there an entrance wound to the President's throat? Was there an entrance wound to the President's back? Was there a wound to the President's head, and if so, where was it located? And what became of the wound to the right temple, which appeared to have been a wound of entrance that might have caused a massive blowout to the back of his head? Theron Ward declined to sign this second version of the President's death certificate and may well have had good reasons for doing so.